In 1961, the Central Intelligence Agency began dropping men out of airplanes over North Vietnam in the dark, with a reasonable expectation that most of them would never come back. It was right about that. Over the next 14 years, the same agency would fight a full-scale war in a country the world had formally agreed to leave alone. It would run an airline that nobody could buy a ticket for, and it would file a number of its own men as dead while they sat breathing in northern prison cells. None of it was in the newspaper. Tonight is about the parts of that war that lived in filing cabinets, and the programs that ran for years, while the official position was that nothing was happening at all. This is a long, slow walk through the covert side of a very loud conflict, told the way secrets are best told, which is softly, and mostly in the dark. You do not need to remember any of it. You are not being tested on it later. Settle in, get the pillow arranged the way you like it, and let the declassified paperwork of a vanished decade carry you gently under. Close your eyes whenever you're ready. 1. Project Tiger. In 1961, a small group of officers in Saigon began recruiting men for a job with a survival rate that would make a lottery ticket look like a sensible investment. The plan was easy to describe and almost impossible to survive. You take a South Vietnamese man, you train him in radio work and light sabotage. You put him on an airplane at night and you drop him by parachute into North Vietnam. Then you wait. Then, usually, you wait a good deal longer. The effort went by several names over the years, but the one that stuck for a while was Project Tiger. It came out of the Central Intelligence Agency, and on paper it made a certain kind of sense. The North was the source of the trouble, so the thinking went, then put trained agents up there. They could gather intelligence, radio at home, perhaps damage a bridge or a rail line, and generally make life inconvenient for Hanoi. That was the theory. Theories are lovely things. They so rarely get shot at. The men chosen for this were not picked at random. A great many of them were Catholics from the North who had fled south in the mid-1950s. After the country was divided in two. Close to 1 million people made that journey. These particular men had grown up in northern villages, spoke with northern accents, and disliked the northern government with the specific, patient heat of people who had lost their homes to it. On paper, they were ideal. They knew the land. They blended in. They were motivated. On paper. The training happened out of sight, in quiet camps, and it was thorough in the way that only a program braced for heavy losses can afford to be. The men learned to work a radio by feel, and to pick a landing zone out of a dark and unfamiliar landscape. They learned to handle explosives without removing their own hands. They learned to move through country that had been specifically told to watch for them. Not all of them went in by parachute. Some were slipped ashore at night from small boats along the coast. A few crossed over land, through the mountains, on foot, one careful step at a time. The doors into the north were different from one another. What waited on the far side of each of them was depressingly similar. You can probably feel where this is heading. You would be right to. Now, here's the thing about dropping a man into hostile territory by parachute in the middle of the night. The enemy tends to notice the airplane. North Vietnam in the early 1960s was not an empty wilderness waiting to be explored. It was a tightly organized security state, with a population trained to report strangers and a Ministry of Public Security that was patient, thorough, and extremely good at its work. A parachute against a night sky is not a subtle object. Neither is a stranger who arrives from nowhere carrying a radio. So the teams came down, and the teams were caught. Not some of them, not most of them, very nearly all of them. Some were captured within hours of landing, before their boots were even dry. Others lasted a few days. A rare handful lasted longer, but the pattern held with a grim, mechanical consistency. You are welcome, by the way, for that soothing image. Rest on it gently. And then, the North Vietnamese did something clever, which is where the story turns from merely sad to quietly chilling. When they captured a radio operator, they did not always announce it. Instead, they sat the captured man down at his own radio and had him keep transmitting. To Saigon, the messages looked entirely genuine. The team was alive. The team was well. The team needed supplies. The team needed reinforcements. So Saigon sent reinforcements, straight into the hands of the people already holding the radio. This is called a radio playback operation, and it is exactly as grim as it sounds. Whole teams were parachuted in to strengthen teams that no longer existed, guided down by friendly messages composed under the closest possible supervision. The men floated into clearings full of soldiers who knew they were coming. It was a trap that quietly refilled itself, and the people running the program in Saigon did not understand what was happening for a long and uncomfortable stretch of time. Let that settle for a moment. The rescue was the trap, the reinforcement was the harvest. Nobody can give you the exact final tally, and you should be a little suspicious of anyone who tries to count it to the last man. But the scale is clear enough. Over the life of the program, dozens of teams and well over 100 men were sent into the north. Only a tiny handful ever came home. Years later, an internal history of the operation, written inside the agency itself and kept locked away for decades, would reach a verdict remarkable mainly for how plainly it was stated. The program had achieved almost nothing of value, and it had cost very nearly everyone who took part in it. That is a hard thing to write about your own work. It is a great deal harder to have lived it. It would be comforting to tell you that someone spotted this early and stopped it. That is not how it went. The insertions carried on, in one shape or another, for years. Agents kept going north. The radios kept talking. And the people who might reasonably have asked why so few teams ever achieved anything, and why almost none ever came home, kept sending more. Once an organization has truly committed to a program, admitting that it does not work becomes the hardest operation of all. In time, the whole effort was handed from the agency to the military, reorganized, renamed, and continued under fresh management. Because that is what large institutions do with a failing project. They seldom cancel it. They restructure it and issue it a new acronym. The drops finally wound down toward the end of the decade. By then, almost everyone involved had understood for years that the men going north were not coming back. And that is the heavy, quiet center of this first story. These were not characters in a spy novel. They were real men, with real families waiting in the South, who stepped out of real airplanes into the dark, on the strength of a promise that somewhere, someone, had a plan that worked. Most of them disappeared. Their names went into files. Some of those files received a small, tidy notation, stating that the man in question was dead. The trouble is that a good number of them were not dead at all. But that is the next story, and it is the one the government would spend 3 decades trying very hard not to discuss. 2. The Lost Commandos. Some of those men were still alive. Not in 1962, when they vanished. In 1985, in prison camps north of Hanoi, long after their own government had closed their files. That is the sentence the United States government would find deeply inconvenient for the better part of 30 years. So let's sit with it while you get comfortable. The commandos who parachuted into the north and vanished were not all killed. A significant number were captured, tried, and sent to prison. And prison, in this case, did not mean a few months. It meant years. For some of them, it meant the better part of 2 decades of their one and only life. They spent it in camps, in a country that officially did not know they existed. Meanwhile, back in the paperwork, a different reality was being written. When a commando failed to return, the program he served needed a way to close his file. And the cleanest way to close a file on a man who has been captured on a mission that does not officially exist is to declare that he has died. So that is what happened. Men who were sitting in northern prison cells, breathing, aging, waiting, were listed as deceased. Their families in the South were informed. In some cases, death benefits were paid. The paperwork was neat. It was also, in a strictly factual sense, a lie. It is worth pausing on how ordinary that decision would have looked from the inside. Nobody had to be cruel to make it happen. A form needed a status. The list of available statuses did not include the one that actually fit, which was something like, captured on a mission this government will never admit took place. So someone chose the nearest option that allowed the file to close. The file closed. The machine moved on to the next file. Real villainy is rarely required for this sort of thing. Tidiness is usually enough. That, if anything, is the detail worth losing a little sleep over. Losing sleep is not the purpose of this channel, so let it drift on past. Now, it would be generous to imagine this as a single clerical error, a stray form filed by mistake. It was not. It was a systemic solution to an awkward problem. A living captured agent is a diplomatic embarrassment and a running expense. A dead agent is a closed case and a folded flag. The bureaucracy chose the version that required less of it. There is a particular kind of tidiness to that decision that should probably keep a person awake, so it is fortunate you are lying down. The men themselves, of course, had no idea they had been declared dead. They were rather busy. When the war ended in 1975, some were eventually released. Some had already served their full sentences and been let out years earlier. A number of them, over time, made their way out of Vietnam and resettled, and some of them settled in the very country that had sent them north and then quietly erased them. Picture that for a moment. You give years of your life to a mission. You survive prison. You cross an ocean. And you arrive to find that on paper you have been dead since the Johnson administration. Some of these men found one another in their new country. They compared notes, and the notes rhymed, and slowly it became clear that what had happened to one of them had happened to a great many. That is often how buried history returns to the surface. Not through a single dramatic revelation, but through a handful of ordinary people, quietly discovering that they share the same impossible story. There is a strange comfort in that, and a strange loneliness too. For years, each of them had assumed he was a private exception, an unlucky one-off. He was, it turned out, part of a pattern that had been running the whole time. For a long time, that is where it stayed. The story was scattered across old, closed files and the memories of aging men, and old closed files are exactly where uncomfortable stories go to be forgotten. What changed things was persistence, and specifically, the persistence of a former military intelligence officer named Sedgwick Torreson, who had worked on Vietnam matters and who began digging into what had actually happened to these commandos. In 1995, he laid the story out in a book called Secret Army, Secret War. Once it was written down in public, it became much harder to keep it in the dark. He had spent years talking with survivors, tracing names through old records, and fitting the fragments into a single coherent account. That is the unglamorous engine behind most historical justice, not a whistle blown in one dramatic instant. Just a patient person with a notebook, refusing to let a story stay buried because burying it was convenient. There was legal pressure. The surviving commandos and the families of those who had been declared dead pressed their case, arguing something quite simple. They had served, they had suffered, they had been listed as dead by their own paymasters while they sat in cells, and the compensation owed to soldiers who serve had never reached them, because officially they had never existed. In 1996, Congress agreed that something was owed. It authorized payments to the surviving commandos and to the families of the men who had been lost, calculated against the years each man had spent in captivity. Compensation came. It came decades late. It came to men their own country had listed as dead, and to widows who had been handed a folded story that was never true. There is a version of this segment that leans hard into outrage, and I am going to decline to write it, partly because it is late, and partly because the facts do the work on their own. A man steps out of an airplane. He is captured. His country decides it is simpler to call him dead than to admit he is alive. He spends 15 or 18 years in a cell. He gets out, crosses the world, and has to prove to a filing system that he was ever born. Some of them lived to see the apology and the payment. Some of them did not. That is the payoff to the story we started with, and it is the reason the first two chapters of this whole thing belong together. Project Tiger sent them into the dark. This is where we learned that the dark had a paper trail, and that the paper trail had been quietly falsified to make an embarrassing problem disappear. Rest easy. The men, at least, eventually got the truth back. It just took the better part of a working lifetime. 3. The Diem coup. On the 24th of August, 1963, a cable went out from Washington to the American Embassy in Saigon. It would help end 2 lives and set the tone for everything that followed. It is known simply by its number, Cable 243, and part of what makes it remarkable is the timing. It went out on a Saturday, in late August, when a great many of the senior people who might have argued about it were out of town for the weekend. This is a small detail, but it is the kind of detail that matters, because governments, like everyone else, make their boldest decisions when the adults are at the beach. The cable told the American ambassador that the United States could no longer support the current arrangement in South Vietnam, and it added something heavier. If the country's generals were prepared to move against the president's brother, the United States would not stand in their way. To understand why, you need the setting, and I will keep it gentle. South Vietnam in 1963 was led by a president named Ngo Dinh Diem, a devout and austere man. He governed alongside his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, who ran the security apparatus. Nhu was widely regarded as the real power behind the throne. The government had grown deeply unpopular, particularly among the country's Buddhist majority, and the summer of 1963 had seen a series of intense public protests. Washington had concluded that the war against the communist insurgency could not be won with this government in place. That is the polite way to put it. The impolite way is that the Americans had decided their ally had become a liability. The summer that led to all this had been a season of open confrontation between the government and the country's Buddhist community, with large demonstrations in the cities and a government response that hardened rather than softened. Word of the unrest traveled around the world and landed on desks in Washington, where patience with Saigon was already running thin. Into this moment arrived a new American ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, a serious and famously ambitious man who took up his post just as the situation reached its most brittle point. He would be the one holding the cable when it came. He would be the one who decided what to do with it. Timing in this story keeps doing a great deal of the work. Enter the Central Intelligence Agency, in the person of a veteran officer named Lucien Conain. Conain was not a desk man. He was an old operator, a survivor of an earlier war, with the kind of personal relationships in Saigon that cannot be manufactured in a memo. He knew the generals, they trusted him, and so Conain became the quiet channel between the plotters in the South Vietnamese army and the American government that had just signaled, in writing, that it would not object to a change in management. He was the connective tissue of the thing. He carried the messages. He confirmed that the Americans were serious. When the moment finally arrived, Conain made his way to the headquarters of the plotting generals and stayed near the center of it, a quiet American presence at a very Vietnamese event. He did not arrive empty-handed. He carried several million piastres, money to support the effort and to look after the families of anyone killed in it. But the cash is not the point of his role. He was not the man giving the orders. He was the man in the room, confirming that the most powerful country on earth would look the other way. Sometimes that is all a plan of this kind requires. Not a push, just permission. The coup came at the beginning of November. The generals moved against the palace, and by the 2nd of November, 1963, both President Diem and his brother Nhu were dead. They had fled the palace and taken shelter, then agreed to surrender on the promise of safe passage. They were placed in the back of an armored personnel carrier. They did not survive the ride. The promise of safe passage turned out to be worth exactly as much as such promises usually are. Here's the thing about that outcome. The evidence suggests that Washington had wanted Diem removed, not killed, and that the deaths came as a genuine shock to the President of the United States, who is said to have gone visibly pale when the news reached him. This is the recurring problem with encouraging a coup from a safe distance. You can open the door. You cannot control what walks through it. Once you tell a group of armed men that you will not stand in their way, the stopping point is theirs. And there is one more date to hold, because history has a cruel sense of symmetry. President Diem and his brother were killed on the 2nd of November, 1963. 20 days later, on the 22nd of November, the American president who had set that machinery in motion was himself assassinated in Dallas. Two men removed from power by violence, 3 weeks apart, on opposite sides of the world. Both fates nodded to a single cable sent on a quiet Saturday. There is a temptation, looking back, to treat all of this as inevitable, as though the machinery could only ever have produced this one result. It could not. At nearly every step, there were people arguing the other way, warning that removing Diem would solve nothing and might well make everything worse. They were, as it turned out, correct. Their memos sit in the record too, filed neatly beside the ones that carried the day. History keeps the losing arguments. It simply does not always get around to reading them in time. The coup did not fix anything, and that is the quiet tragedy sitting underneath the whole episode. The generals who removed Diem could not hold the country together, and the government they formed was itself pushed aside within months. Then that one fell, then another after it. For more than a year, Saigon churned through leaders at a pace that would be almost comic if the stakes had not been so grave. Each new set of hands proved a little weaker than the last, and the war they were meant to be winning only grew. The Americans had removed a leader they found difficult, hoping to discover one they would find easy. Instead, they found instability, and then they found themselves pulled further in to manage it. The door, once opened, would not close. It is a heavy note to end on, so I will simply leave it there, in the dark, where it belongs. You have been listening for a little while now, and if your thoughts have started to go soft and slow at the edges, that is exactly the point. There is no urgency here. Nothing in these old files needs anything from you tonight. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the next story arrive on its own. We are only just getting started, and the pace from here is deliberately, mercifully slow. 4. Operation Switchback. Not every buried operation ends in a prison cell or a palace coup. Some end in a memo. In 1962, in an office in Washington, one of those memos quietly redrew the entire covert war. No gunfire, just a signature. This one is quieter than the others, which makes it a nice place to slow the breathing down. Beginning in 1962, alongside all the drama we have already walked through, something distinctly undramatic was taking place behind the scenes. The Central Intelligence Agency was handing a large portion of its paramilitary work in Vietnam over to the United States military. The operation that managed this handover was called Switchback, and it took about a year to complete. It is one of those turning points that never makes the movies. Nobody parachutes anywhere, and the climax is an organizational chart. To see why it mattered, you have to understand how the covert war had grown. When the agency first started building armed programs in Vietnam, they were small, deniable, and manageable by a relatively compact group of officers. That is the natural habitat of an intelligence service. It likes to work quietly, with limited numbers, keeping a light footprint and a plausible distance from the government it serves. Secrecy and small scale go together. There was also a policy current pushing in the same direction. Earlier in the decade, the Kennedy White House had put out guidance meant to settle a genuinely awkward question, namely, who inside the government should own large paramilitary operations. And the drift of that thinking ran toward the military. The agency could start something small and deniable, the reasoning went. But once a secret army had grown into an actual army, it belonged with the institution that was built to run armies in the first place. Switchback was the point where that tidy, abstract principle collided with the concrete reality of Vietnam. The reality, as usual, was heavier than the principle. But the programs did not stay small. The flagship example was something called the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, a sprawling effort to arm and organize villagers, particularly the mountain peoples of the Central Highlands, to defend their own communities against the insurgency. It had begun modestly, with a single area and a small handful of American advisors, and it had worked well enough that it spread. Success, in a program like this, becomes its own kind of problem. Every new village that joined meant more weapons to supply, more men to pay, more radios to service, and more ground to defend. The thing grew the way a small fire grows in the dry season, which is to say, faster than anyone had quite planned for. If you are still with me, and I hope you are drifting a little by now, hold on to that image of a spreading fire. It is the whole shape of this chapter in miniature. We will come back to that world in a moment, because it deserves its own chapter. For now, the important thing is the arithmetic. A program that begins with a handful of villages and a few advisors can, if it succeeds, balloon into tens of thousands of armed men and mountains of equipment. No small intelligence outfit can feed that. And that is the problem Switchback was built to solve. The agency had, in a sense, been too successful. It had grown a paramilitary enterprise so large that running it was no longer a spy's job, it was a soldier's job. Feeding, arming, paying, and directing that many men is exactly the kind of heavy, industrial-scale work that a national military exists to do, and exactly the kind of work an intelligence service is not designed for. So the decision was made at the highest levels to move these programs out of the agency's hands and into the military's. The quiet operators would step back. The uniformed institution would take the weight. There was a logic to it that went beyond simple bookkeeping. There was a broader belief in Washington in the early 1960s that large paramilitary undertakings ought to sit with the Department of Defense rather than the agency. The reasoning was practical. Such programs had grown too big to hide and too expensive to run on the side. If you are going to field an army, the reasoning went, perhaps it should be run by the people whose actual job is fielding armies. It is hard to argue with, which is why it is one of the least argued about decisions in this entire story. The paperwork, it turned out, was the easy part. Handing over the relationships was the hard one. The agency's officers had spent years building trust with the men and communities they worked alongside. And trust does not transfer with a signature. When the military took over these programs, it took over the equipment and the payrolls and the maps. But it inherited a set of human relationships it had not built and did not always understand. The switch on the organizational chart was clean. The reality on the ground was a good deal messier, and some of that messiness would echo for years. Switchback also did something with a longer shadow. By moving covert paramilitary work firmly under the military's roof, it helped set the stage for something new. The following year, a dedicated organization for cross-border and unconventional operations would be created. It would go on to carry out some of the most secret missions of the entire war. We will meet that organization soon. On the ground, much of the handover ran through the Army's Special Forces, the soldiers in the Green Berets, who took formal responsibility for the Highland programs and the men inside them. They were, in fairness, well suited to it. Training and leading irregular fighters sits close to the original purpose of that part of the army. But even a good fit is still a change, and the men in the villages had signed on with one set of Americans and now found themselves answering to another. Trust built patiently over years does not always survive a transfer of command. Some of it held, some of it frayed at the edges, and the deeper strain, the one between the Highland peoples and the distant government in Saigon, was something no reorganization on Earth could fix. It would keep surfacing, quietly and then loudly, for the rest of the war. For tonight, it is enough to know that a great deal of what came later flowed through a door. An unglamorous administrative operation opened it. It is easy to skip past a chapter like this one on the way to the louder ones. Coups and prison camps hold the attention in a way that an inter-office transfer never quite will. But wars are shaped in both places, and often the memo does more lasting damage than the raid. A decision about who runs a program quietly determines who it answers to, how it is judged, and what happens when it eventually goes wrong. Switchback made those calls for a whole category of secret operations, and it made them years before most of those operations reached their darkest hours. So there it is, the rare chapter in a spy story where the decisive weapon is a reorganization. No gunfire, no parachutes, just a transfer of responsibility, signed and filed, that changed the shape of the war without a single dramatic scene. Sometimes the most consequential thing in a room full of secrets is the person who decides whose job the secret becomes next. 5. The country inside the country. By 1962, the people doing most of the fighting in the central highlands of South Vietnam were not, in the eyes of the government in Saigon, entirely Vietnamese. They were the mountain peoples, dozens of distinct groups with their own languages and their own customs, whom the French had once lumped together under a single borrowed word. The lowland majority had long regarded them with a mixture of suspicion and neglect. They lived in the high, forested spine of the country, far from the coastal cities, and for centuries they had mostly been left alone, which is a polite way of saying mostly overlooked. Then the war arrived in their hills, and all at once, everyone wanted to be their friend. The Central Intelligence Agency wanted it most of all. The logic was straightforward, almost elegant. The highlands were strategic ground, laced with the trails and passes that fed the insurgency from the north and the west. The people who lived there knew every ridge and stream of it. If you could arm them, organize them, and earn their loyalty, you would have a living shield across the most porous part of the country, held by the only people who truly understood the terrain. That was the seed of the program we brushed against earlier, the one built around village self-defense. But arming villagers is the easy part. You have plenty of rifles. Keeping those villagers on your side, year after year, through fear and boredom and broken promises, is the hard part. And that is where this chapter earns its place. The agency's answer was not only military. It was something closer to social engineering, delivered gently, one hamlet at a time. Small teams of trained Vietnamese cadres, sometimes called People's Action Teams, would move into a village and simply live there. They did not roll through in trucks and leave at dusk. They stayed. They slept in the village, ate what the village ate, and made themselves part of the daily rhythm of the place. The theory was that security is not a patrol. Security is a neighbor who does not leave when the sun goes down. While they lived there, these teams did something that sounds dull and was in fact quietly radical. They took a census, not merely counting heads, but sitting with families and asking them what they needed, what they feared, and what the government had failed to do for them. Every grievance was written down: a well that had gone dry, a road that flooded each rainy season, a local official who took more than his share. The idea was to pair the counting of people with the cataloging of their complaints, and then, crucially, to actually fix some of them. Win the small arguments, the thinking went, and you might win the large one. If you are wondering whether that ever really worked, the honest answer is, sometimes, and never as reliably as its designers hoped. Still, take a moment to appreciate the ambition of it. Somewhere in the paperwork of a covert war, someone had concluded that the way to defeat an insurgency was to be a more attentive listener than the enemy. It is one of the stranger and more human ideas in this whole nocturnal catalog. It is worth saying that this gentle theory had a blunter cousin running at the same time, a government effort to gather rural families into fortified settlements that could be defended and watched. That harsher approach, built on relocation, tended to generate exactly the resentment the listening teams were trying to soothe. The two philosophies coexisted uneasily, the patient one and the forceful one, sometimes in the very same province. It is a small illustration of a larger truth about the whole war. There was rarely a single American plan. There were competing plans, wearing the same uniform, occasionally undoing one another's work. What all of this was building, brick by patient brick, was a parallel structure. A second, quiet system of authority laid gently over the top of the existing one. There was the official government, with its provinces, and its officials, and its army. And then there was this other thing, this web of armed villages, and live-in cadres, and grievance ledgers, funded and guided from the shadows. Its loyalty ran, in the first instance, not to a distant capital, but to the people who showed up and stayed. You might call it a benign occupation, or a foreign-built shadow state, depending entirely on where you happen to stand. In effect, the agency was building a country inside the country. Here's the thing about building a shadow structure alongside a real one. The real one tends to notice, and it tends not to love the experience. The government in Saigon had always been uneasy about arming the highland peoples, whom it did not fully trust, and had never fully embraced. Watching a foreign intelligence service turn those same peoples into a loyal, organized, well-equipped force did nothing to calm those nerves. There were tensions, there were resentments. There were moments when the shield the agency had built seemed as likely to turn on the capital as to defend it. Some of those highland communities had ambitions of their own that fit awkwardly inside anyone else's plans. They wanted a measure of autonomy, a recognition of their distinct identity, a seat at a table that had long refused to set them a place. An armed and organized people is a people with leverage, and leverage tends to get used. At various points, the friction between the Highlanders and the lowland government flared into open confrontation, and the Americans in the middle found themselves in a deeply familiar position. They had built something they could not fully control. You arm a partner for your own reasons. The partner, quite reasonably, turns out to have reasons of their own. And underneath all of it sat a hard question that no census could answer. What happens to a parallel structure when the people who built it decide to go home? A shadow government is only as durable as the outsiders funding it, and outsiders, eventually, leave. The wells they dug would remain. The grievances they wrote down would not all be solved. The trust they earned would be inherited by whoever came next, if anyone did. For now, though, in the early and middle years of the decade, the machine was still being assembled, and its designers still believed it might work. The counting continued. The teams stayed in their villages. The quiet country inside the country kept taking shape, one listened-to complaint at a time. It was patient, unglamorous work, and much of it would soon be swept aside by a louder kind of war entirely. You can decide for yourself whether the whole idea was noble or naive, or some uneasy blend of the two. The people who built it believed, at least for a while, that a war might be won by paying closer attention than the other side. History would test that belief hard, and it would not return a simple grade. That louder war is where we go next. 6. The unit with the boring name. In 1964, the United States military created a unit with a name so deliberately bland, it could have been mistaken for a paperwork office. It was called, in full, the Studies and Observations Group. If you were a curious clerk who stumbled across that title in a directory, you would assume it was a room full of analysts, producing reports that no one read. You would move on. Which was, of course, entirely the point. The Studies and Observations Group studied very little and observed a great deal, usually from behind enemy lines, often while being shot at. It was created on the 24th of January 1964, and it became the military's home for the most secret operations of the war. Cross-border reconnaissance. Raids into territory the United States was not officially fighting in. The recovery of downed pilots from places that did not appear on any public map. This was the organization that inherited the covert paramilitary work handed over in the reshuffle we discussed earlier. It carried that work to places the earlier programs had only gestured toward. The men of this group did work that sounds like fiction and was entirely real. Small teams, a few Americans alongside local fighters, would slip across borders into territory where the United States was not officially operating. They would watch enemy movement along hidden supply routes, then slip back out again, often with the enemy in close pursuit. They called crossing that unofficial line going across the fence. It was some of the most hazardous work of the entire war, and the men who did it accepted losses that are difficult to describe gently. They went where the maps went blank. A fair number of them never came back from the blank spaces. What made it stranger still was the deniability wrapped around the whole thing. If a mission went wrong in a country the United States was not fighting in, there could be no acknowledgement, no public mourning, no straightforward account for a grieving family. The work was real and the danger was real, but the official record was built to stay silent about both. These were men asked to take extraordinary risks on the explicit understanding that their own government might never confirm they had taken them. Courage is one thing. Anonymous courage, agreed to in advance, is something else entirely. Picture it for a moment, if you are still awake enough to picture anything. A man steps off into hostile dark, knowing that if he does not step back out, no official page will ever say he was there. Running alongside it, or feeding into the same dark stream, was a plan with an equally forgettable label. It was known as Operations Plan 34 Alpha, and its purpose was to bring the pressure directly to North Vietnam. Small teams and fast boats would strike at the northern coast. They would raid installations, gather intelligence, and generally remind Hanoi that the war could reach into its own front yard. These were not large operations. They were needles, not hammers. But they were real. They were secret. And they were happening in one very specific stretch of water, at one very specific moment. This plan had a lineage too. It grew in part out of the very programs the agency had handed to the military in the reshuffle we walked through earlier, the covert paramilitary work that changed owners but never stopped. What had begun as one institution's quiet errand became another institution's official mission, scaled up and pointed north. That is the through line of so much of this story. Nothing here is ever truly cancelled. It is inherited, renamed, and continued by the next set of hands, usually with a larger budget and a blander title. That water was the Gulf of Tonkin. That moment was the first week of August, 1964. You may know the name Gulf of Tonkin even if you know nothing else about this war, because what happened there became the doorway through which the United States walked into full-scale involvement. In early August, an American destroyer was operating in those waters, gathering electronic intelligence. It reported an attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, it reported a second attack. That second report, the one that lit the fuse, is now widely doubted by historians, who suspect the crew was reading ghosts on their instruments in a dark and jumpy sea. But at the time, 2 attacks were reported and 2 attacks were believed. Here is the part that connects to everything we have just walked through. Those covert raids on the northern coast, the needle strikes of the 34 Alpha Plan, were taking place in the same general waters in the same general days. From Hanoi's point of view, the sea was already alive with American mischief. From Washington's point of view, an American ship had been attacked without provocation. 2 different navies, looking at the same dark water, told themselves 2 entirely different stories about what was happening in it. Neither had the full picture. Both acted anyway. The consequence was enormous and swift. Within days, the American Congress passed a resolution handing the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. It passed almost unanimously. It became the legal foundation for years of open war, and it rested, in part, on a naval incident whose second half most likely never occurred. The waters were already crowded with secret operations the public knew nothing about. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. A covert program most Americans had never heard of was operating in the exact place where a very public war would be justified. The secret war and the open war were not separate stories. They were the same story, and the seam between them ran right through the Gulf of Tonkin. The resolution that followed took its name from that gulf, and it became one of the most consequential votes in the country's modern history. It passed the lower chamber without a single dissenting voice, and cleared the upper one with only 2. On the strength of it, the American commitment deepened from advisors and secret raids into a vast and open war. Years later, declassified internal studies, including one produced within the very agency responsible for the electronic intelligence, concluded that the second reported attack, the decisive one, almost certainly never happened. The doorway to the war, it turned out, had been built partly out of a mistake that no one had the appetite to correct in time. You can lose a great deal in the space between what a nervous crew reports and what a determined capital wants to hear. None of this was visible at the time. The men in the fast boats did not know they were about to become a footnote to a resolution. The clerks who saw the boring name in the directory did not know it belonged to the most dangerous errand runners of the war. That is the strange arithmetic of secrecy. The most consequential things wear the dullest labels, and the loudest events grow from the quietest roots. The needle came first, then came the hammer. We are past the middle of this now, deep in the small hours and deep in the story. If sleep has already found you, that is not a failure. That is the whole design, and the words will go on without you in the dark. If you are still here, let your breathing slow to match the pace of the telling. There is no hurry tonight. There was never going to be. 7. The war that was not happening. Vang Pao was a young officer with a rare gift for leadership, and a homeland that was, officially, not at war at all. He was a leader of the Hmong, a people of the mountains of Laos. Over the course of the 1960s, he would become the central figure in what was, by most accounts, the largest paramilitary operation the Central Intelligence Agency had ever run. The strange part is the one that keeps this story up at night. It happened in a country the world had formally agreed to leave alone. To understand it, you need one piece of paper and one act of collective pretending. In the early 1960s, the major powers signed an agreement declaring Laos neutral. Everyone would keep their soldiers out. Everyone would respect its borders. Everyone signed. And then, almost immediately, everyone found quiet ways not to mean it. North Vietnamese forces used Laotian territory to move men and supplies south. And the United States, unwilling to concede that ground, chose to fight back in a way that would not technically violate the agreement it had just signed. It would not send an army. It would send the agency. That neutrality agreement was, on paper, a genuine triumph of diplomacy. Laos would be independent and left in peace by its larger neighbors. And for a moment, the region seemed to have talked itself out of a wider fight. In practice, the treaty was honored the way such treaties often are, which is to say, selectively and with a very straight face. The trails that fed the war to the south ran straight through Laotian ground, and giving up that ground was unthinkable in Washington. So the peace everyone had signed became the peace almost no one kept, and the pretending began in earnest. So the agency built one. Working through Vang Pao and drawing on the Hmong and other highland peoples, it raised, armed, trained, and paid a force of considerable size. That force fought a full-scale war against North Vietnamese troops and their allies, year after year, across the mountains of a country that was supposedly at peace. There were airstrips carved into remote valleys. There was a hidden headquarters that became, for a time, one of the busiest airfields on Earth, a place that appeared on no tourist map and in no news report. Let that image settle over you as you drift. An airfield roaring with traffic that officially was not there at all. There were pilots and advisors and vast quantities of equipment, all moving through a war that the American public was assured did not exist. There was also a war in the air over Laos of staggering proportions. For years, American aircraft flew countless missions against the supply routes and the forces contesting them. The bombing campaign was so sustained that Laos is often described by those who study it as among the most heavily bombed places in history for its size. Much of that ordnance fell on a country that officially was not a battlefield at all. Some of it did not explode on impact. It has gone on causing harm in those fields and forests for decades since. A quiet and dangerous inheritance, left by a war that was never declared. Directing some of that air power were small numbers of American pilots who flew low and slow over the fighting in tiny planes, living rough alongside their allies. They operated under a program whose very existence was denied. They wore civilian clothes and carried nothing to prove who they were, so that if they fell, the war they were fighting could go on not existing. It is a remarkable thing to ask of a person. Fight, and if you die, do so anonymously, for a cause your own country will not admit to. Sit with that for a moment before you drift off. It is one of the loneliest bargains in this entire story. Take a breath here, because the doublethink of it is genuinely dizzying. Ordinary Americans could open a newspaper and read nothing about Laos, because officially nothing was happening in Laos. Meanwhile, in those same mountains, a serious and grinding war was consuming lives on a large scale. The gap between the public story and the private reality was not a small fudge. It was a canyon. An entire war, with all its cost and courage and loss, was being conducted in the space between what was true and what was admitted. For the Hmong, the cost was staggering, and it was borne over many years. They fought as America's allies in America's undeclared war, and they did so with remarkable endurance in punishing conditions. When the wider war finally ended and the Americans withdrew, that alliance did not simply close its books. Many Hmong faced grave danger for the side they had chosen, and large numbers eventually left their homeland altogether, resettling across the world, including in the United States, where their communities remain to this day. A people who had lived in those mountains for generations were scattered by a war their neighbors were told was not taking place. The sheer scale of the whole undertaking is worth holding in your mind as it fades. This was not a handful of advisors and a few crates of rifles. It ran for well over a decade, from the early 1960s until the wider war collapsed in 1975. It grew into a full military enterprise, with its own air support, its own supply lines, and its own front lines shifting back and forth across the same exhausted valleys. And it was, from beginning to end, a thing the world had formally agreed did not exist. Few secrets in modern history have been kept so large for so long. It is a strange monument, a war remembered mostly by the people who managed to survive it. This is the point in the night where the jokes rightly go quiet. There is dry irony in a secret war, in boring unit names and neutral treaties observed in the breach. There is nothing amusing about the human weight of it, so let it simply sit there, plainly, the way true things should. A war was fought. It was denied while it happened. The people who fought it hardest were the ones with the least protection when it was over. The secret held for a surprisingly long time, though not forever. Reporters chipped at it. Officials dodged questions with practiced grace. And slowly, over years, the shape of the thing became too large to hide, until the war that was not happening became a war that everyone quietly knew had happened. By then it was history, which is where inconvenient truths go to be acknowledged at last, safely after they can no longer be prevented. We will stay in the skies over this region for the next story, because you cannot run a war in trackless mountains without a very particular kind of airline. But first, a small housekeeping matter, and then I promise to leave you undisturbed for the rest of the night. If these slow, quiet histories are doing their work, and your eyes are heavier now than when we began, then you may simply want more of them on the nights when sleep will not come on its own. Subscribing is the easiest way to let these long, dark, unhurried stories find their way back to you. That is the only thing I will ever ask, and I have now asked it. No more requests after this. Now, gently, back into the dark. 8. The airline you could not book. It was an airline with no logo anyone would recognize, no schedule anyone could consult, and no ticket anyone could ever buy. It was called Air America, and for years it flew some of the most demanding missions in Southeast Asia, while belonging, through a quiet chain of ownership, to the Central Intelligence Agency itself. If you needed cargo delivered to a dirt strip on a mountainside that officially did not exist, this was the airline you called. Assuming, of course, that you were the sort of person allowed to know its number. The airline had roots that reached back before this war. It had grown out of an earlier outfit founded by a famous American aviator who had flown in China, an operation the agency quietly acquired and reshaped for its own purposes. By the height of the secret war, it flew a whole menagerie of aircraft, from lumbering transports to nimble helicopters, out of a web of airstrips scattered across the region. Officially, it was a business, with account books and a corporate name. In truth, it was an instrument of policy with propellers. Its crews were adventurers, seasoned professionals, and true believers. It may have been the strangest flying job on Earth. On paper, Air America was an ordinary air transport company. In practice, it was the circulatory system of the secret war. Its pilots flew rice and supplies into remote villages, dropping pallets to people who had no other lifeline. They inserted and recovered small reconnaissance teams in country so rugged that a helicopter was the only way in or out. They flew search and rescue, plucking downed airmen out of jungle and off hillsides, frequently while under fire. The work was constant, it was dangerous, and a good number of the men who did it did not come home from it. There is real admiration owed to that flying, and it should be said plainly before anything else. Pulling a wounded man off a ridge in bad weather with people shooting at you is not a job for the faint of heart. Many Air America crews performed acts of genuine skill and courage in appalling conditions, and some of them died doing it. Whatever else this airline was, it was also that. Keep that firmly in mind, because the next part is more complicated, and it deserves to be handled with care. The conditions those crews flew in would test anyone alive. Landing strips were often little more than a scraped clearing on the shoulder of a mountain, tilted and short and ringed by high ground, held by people who wished the aircraft ill. Weather closed in without warning. On some of those approaches, there was no going around, because there was nowhere to go. To fly supplies into a place like that, day after day, and then to turn around and do it again the moment the clouds lifted, took a particular blend of skill and stubbornness. It is easy to romanticize from a warm bed. It was genuinely hard to live. Air America, and the wider covert effort it served, has for decades been shadowed by a serious allegation. The most influential version of it appeared in a book published in 1972 by a scholar named Alfred McCoy. He argued that elements of the American covert apparatus in Southeast Asia were entangled, directly or indirectly, with the region's opium and heroin trade. The claim, broadly, was that in the course of supporting local allies whose economies ran partly on the drug, the secret war had at times looked the other way. Its aircraft and networks, the argument went, had at times been used to move the product. Now, here is where a careful narrator slows down. That allegation is exactly that, an allegation, and a contested one. It has been argued, denied, investigated, and argued again for half a century. Some accounts support pieces of it. Official inquiries have disputed the strongest versions. The people who defend the airline point out, not unreasonably, that its crews were flying rescue and resupply, not running a smuggling ring. The presence of the drug trade in a region, they add, is not the same as the direction of it from a headquarters. This is genuinely disputed ground, and anyone who hands you a tidy verdict on it, in either direction, is selling you more certainty than the record supports. It is one of those historical arguments where the loudest voices tend to be the least reliable, and where the honest position is also the least satisfying. You are allowed to leave it unsettled. In fact, the evidence rather insists that you do. So let us do the honest thing and hold two ideas at once, which is uncomfortable but accurate. The flying was often heroic. The allegation about the drug trade is serious, long-standing, attributed most famously to McCoy, and unresolved. Both of those statements can share a page. History is frequently like this. It refuses to sort its characters into clean piles of hero and villain, and it is at its most instructive precisely when it declines to. What is not in dispute is the sheer strangeness of the enterprise. A government intelligence agency owned an airline, staffed it with civilian pilots, and used it to sustain a war that the same government insisted was not occurring. The men who flew it operated in a legal and moral twilight, doing extraordinary things for reasons they were often not fully told, in service of policies decided far above them. Some of them believed in it deeply. Some of them just liked to fly. Most of them, one suspects, simply did the job in front of them, and left the larger questions to people with cleaner offices. When it was all finally over, the airline wound down along with the war it had served, and slipped into a strange afterlife of films and memoirs and unresolved arguments. Its name became a kind of shorthand for the entire shadow enterprise, invoked freely by people who had never been within 1,000 miles of those mountains. Some of the men who flew it spent the rest of their lives insisting that the darkest allegations were a slander on honorable work done in impossible conditions. Others were quieter and less certain. The record kept both groups and settled the matter for neither. That, in the end, may be the airline's truest legacy, an argument with no verdict, still circling like an aircraft that cannot find the strip. It has been dramatized, romanticized, condemned, and defended, which is roughly what happens to any institution that lived entirely in the shadows and then had the shadows pulled away. The plain facts sit underneath all of that noise, quieter and harder to dramatize. There was an airline you could not book. It did brave things and it flew through contested skies, and the argument about what else it may have carried is still, all these years later, unfinished. 9. The analyst who was right. What happens when an intelligence analyst turns out to be right at the worst possible moment? His name was Sam Adams, and in 1967 he found out. He spent the rest of his career paying for the privilege. He was an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency in the middle years of the war. His job, unglamorous and enormously important, was to help answer a deceptively simple question. How many of the enemy were there? Not in a poetic sense, in a literal, countable sense. How many fighters, of all kinds, was the United States actually facing in Vietnam? Because if you do not know the size of the problem, you cannot possibly know whether you are winning. The disagreement, at its heart, was about who counted as the enemy. Everyone agreed on the main force units, the regular soldiers in organized formations. The argument was over everyone else, the part-time village fighters, the self-defense militias, the shadow organizers who carried no rifle in daylight. Adams became convinced that these people were a real and enormous part of the enemy's strength, and that leaving them out of the count produced a picture that was not merely incomplete, but actively misleading. Others argued they should not be counted as combatants at all. It sounds like an accountant's quarrel. It was, in truth, an argument about the size and the very nature of the entire war. In 1967, Adams became convinced that the official answer was badly, dangerously wrong. Working through captured documents and his own painstaking arithmetic, he came to believe that the enemy's true strength was far larger than the numbers the military was reporting. And here are the two numbers, because a chapter about a number should probably give you one. The official order of battle sat at roughly 280,000. Adams's own work pointed towards something closer to double that. It included the irregular forces, the part-time fighters, the village militias, and the support networks the official tally had quietly set aside. This mattered enormously, and not as a matter of bookkeeping pride. 280,000 told a story of an enemy being ground down, of a war on track, of light at the end of the tunnel. Twice that number told a very different story, of an opponent far more numerous and resilient than the public had been led to believe. The two figures were not just different arithmetic. They were different wars. Only one of them could be true. Adams pushed. He argued, he wrote, he escalated. And he ran into something that anyone who has worked inside a large institution will recognize with a wince. The organization had, in effect, already decided what the answer was going to be. A higher enemy count was not merely inconvenient. It contradicted the story that had been told to the public and to the government about how the war was going. So the higher numbers were resisted, negotiated down, and kept from becoming the official truth. A ceiling was placed on reality, because reality above that ceiling was politically unbearable. There was a meeting, later, where representatives of the different institutions sat down and, in effect, negotiated the enemy's strength as though it were a clause in a contract. Numbers were traded back and forth. A figure was settled upon, and the figure that emerged owed at least as much to what was politically tolerable as to what the evidence actually suggested. Reality does not usually get a seat at the conference table. On that occasion, a version of it did, and it left the room noticeably smaller than it had been when it walked in. You can probably guess how this ends, because history already ran the experiment. In the final days of January 1968, the enemy launched an enormous, coordinated offensive across the whole of South Vietnam, striking dozens of cities and towns at once, in what became known as the Tet Offensive. Militarily, the attackers suffered heavily and did not hold the ground they seized. But that was not the point. The point was that they had been able to mount an operation of that scale and coordination at all. An enemy, supposedly on its last legs, had just demonstrated reach that the official numbers said should have been impossible. The shock was not only tactical, it was a shock to the story itself. Americans had been told the war was being steadily won, and now their television screens showed fighting in the heart of cities that were supposed to be secure. The gap between the official narrative and the visible reality snapped open in a single week, and it never fully closed again. You can feel the echo of that moment even now, every time an official story and a plain fact refused to line up. Public trust in the optimistic version of the war began to drain away, and much of it never came back. The turn in the public mood was captured, famously, when one of the most trusted broadcasters in the country returned from Vietnam and told his audience, in sober and careful tones, that the war now seemed mired in stalemate. When a messenger that's steady begins to doubt, the doubt travels fast. As for Adams, his conviction that the numbers had been deliberately managed never faded. Years later, it became the backbone of a long and bitter libel trial. After a television documentary, he had helped shape accused a senior commander of suppressing the figures. The case was eventually settled without a clear winner, which is a fitting ending for a fight about a number nobody could pin down. Sam Adams had, in the most painful way imaginable, been proven right. There is no triumph in that sentence, only a kind of grim vindication. He had warned that the numbers were being suppressed, and then an offensive arrived that made the suppression impossible to ignore. He spent years afterward pressing the issue, convinced that the manipulation of those figures was a scandal in its own right, and his crusade would eventually spill into a famous courtroom battle over how the war's story had been told. He never quite let it go. You can hear, in that refusal, a man who simply could not let an untruth lie down. It is hard to blame him. The lesson underneath his story is older than this war and will outlast it. Institutions do not always want the truth. Sometimes they want the number that lets them keep believing what they have already decided to believe. The person who insists on the real figure, in a room that has agreed on a comfortable one, is rarely thanked in the moment. Sometimes the honest arithmetic only gets its due long after it stopped being able to change anything. Adams himself seems to have understood this, and to have been quite unable to accept it, which is its own quiet tragedy. He had the rare and unenviable experience of watching the future arrive exactly as he had warned it would, and of receiving, for his foresight, mostly grief. Being right, it turns out, is not at all the same thing as being heard. We are nearly at the end now, with only 2 stories left, and they are the ones where the buried things are finally dug up and set in the light. But there is no need to hold on for the finish. Nothing here will vanish if your eyes close before it. Let the last of the day's tension leave your hands and your jaw. Sink a little further into the quiet. We are almost home. The program named after a bird. Few operations from this war carry a heavier reputation than the one named, with a certain grim poetry, after a mythical bird that rises from its own ashes. It was called the Phoenix Program, and even now, decades later, the name alone can end a dinner conversation. Tonight we will do the harder and more useful thing and look at it plainly. No mythology to inflate it, no euphemism to hide it. The problem Phoenix was built to solve was real, and, from a counterinsurgency standpoint, central. The insurgency in South Vietnam was not only an army in the field, it was also a hidden political network woven through the villages, an underground structure of organizers, tax collectors, recruiters, and shadow officials who kept the movement alive. You could win every firefight and still lose, because this quiet network would simply rebuild itself after you left. Phoenix, which took shape around 1967, was the coordinated effort to dismantle that network by pooling intelligence from many agencies and acting on it. The word the program used for its goal was neutralization, and the word did a great deal of quiet work. To neutralize a member of the network could mean several things. It could mean persuading them to defect, through a broad amnesty program that welcomed those who changed sides. It could mean capturing them for interrogation, and it could mean killing them. The bland vocabulary covered a wide moral distance, from a leaflet inviting surrender to a raid that ended in a death, and that elasticity is a large part of why the program's reputation is what it is. Hold that distance in your mind as you drift, because it is precisely where the whole argument about this program lives. The program did not spring from nowhere. It sat inside a larger civilian and military effort to organize pacification under a single roof, and it drew on an existing amnesty scheme that had long invited members of the insurgency to come over to the government's side, no questions asked. Many did, Defection was, on paper, the preferred outcome. Cheaper and cleaner than any raid, and better intelligence besides. But defection is not what the program is remembered for. The reason lives in the gap between how a system is designed and how it behaves under pressure. Much of the sharp-end work fell to units known as provincial reconnaissance units, small teams that acted on the intelligence Phoenix gathered. The program also ran through a network of interrogation centers at the province level, and it is here, honestly, that the darkest allegations cluster. There were serious and credible accounts of abuse and mistreatment within that system, allegations that were later aired in congressional testimony and have been documented by historians. I am not going to dwell in that room tonight, both because the details are grim and because the fact of the allegations, soberly noted, is what matters here. You do not need the specifics to feel the shape of the danger in it. There was another structural flaw that critics have long emphasized. When a program measures its success by numbers, numbers are what it will produce, and not always honestly. A local official with a grudge could denounce a neighbor. A quota could be satisfied with a name that did not belong on any list. In a village war fought with poor information and enormous stakes, the machinery could and sometimes did consume innocent people, and the tidy totals in the reports could not tell a genuine operative apart from a settled score. That possibility was built into the very design. It is why defenders and critics have never agreed on what the program truly was. Presiding over much of this was a man named William Colby, who ran the broader pacification effort of which Phoenix was a part, and who later rose to lead the entire Central Intelligence Agency. Colby did something unusual for a man in his position. He testified about the program in public, before Congress, and defended it, arguing that it was a legitimate and largely lawful campaign against an armed enemy's command structure, while acknowledging that abuses had occurred. Whatever you make of that defense, the willingness to sit in the chair and answer for it is part of the record. It is worth noting what became of him, because it complicates any simple picture. The same man who defended this program would, a few years later and by then at the very top of the agency, become an unusually forthcoming witness during the great investigations that closed out this era. He volunteered uncomfortable truths that some of his colleagues would much rather have kept buried. Villain, reformer, or simply a professional who followed the institution wherever it led. That is exactly the sort of question this program leaves you holding, unresolved, in the dark. Now, the numbers, and here we must be careful, because this is precisely where sloppiness turns into misinformation. Between 1968 and 1972, by the program's own accounting, roughly 81,700 people were neutralized. Of those, a little over 26,000 were killed. Now hold that second figure still for a moment, because there is a detail buried inside it that almost never survives the retelling. Of the people killed, roughly 7 in 8 died in conventional military operations carried out by South Vietnamese and American forces. Only the remaining 1 in 8 was attributed to Phoenix operatives directly. There is a second set of books as well. South Vietnamese government figures, reported by the journalist Seymour Hersh, put the number killed closer to 41,000, and when Colby sat in front of Congress in 1971 and gave a figure for a shorter window, he said 20,587. Different books, different windows, different ideas about who counted. Anyone who quotes you one of those numbers without telling you which is not being careful with you. Underneath the statistics is a genuinely hard question, one that the program's defenders and critics have never resolved. Was Phoenix a legitimate, if brutal, campaign against a real armed network, waged under wartime conditions? Or did its bland vocabulary and its village-level machinery inevitably produce abuse, false accusations, and deaths that no amount of paperwork could justify? The honest answer is that it holds elements of both, and that where you land depends heavily on which cases you look at and how much you trust the counting. This is not a story that resolves into a comfortable moral. It resists that, and it should. So we leave it as it actually is, unresolved and heavy, a program named for rebirth that dealt overwhelmingly in endings. It was, at minimum, one of the most consequential and controversial undertakings of the entire secret war, and it did its work in the shadows for years before the light of hearings and history reached it. You will notice that this is the third or fourth time tonight that a story has ended not with an answer, but with the light arriving late. That is not laziness on my part. It is simply the shape this particular war keeps insisting on. That reaching of the light is the last part of our story, and it is where we finally turn now. 11. The Reckoning. In 1975, the secrets began, at last, to come home. For more than a decade, the covert side of this war had lived in filing cabinets and behind classifications, known in full to almost no one. Then, in the mid-1970s, a series of investigations pried open the drawers. A great deal of what had been buried was finally laid on a table where the public could see it. The change did not come from nowhere. The country had passed through years that had drained its trust in the quiet workings of its own government. A war that had been sold as nearly won had gone bitterly wrong. A political scandal had toppled a president. By the time the middle of the decade arrived, the appetite for taking official secrecy on faith was gone. Congress sensed the mood and looked directly into what had long been kept from it. The spark, in large part, was a newspaper. Late in 1974, a reporter published a detailed account of the intelligence establishment spying on Americans at home, and the story landed like a stone through a window. It took the abstract worry about unaccountable secrecy and made it suddenly, uncomfortably concrete. It forced the government's hand. What followed was a stretch of investigation so intense that historians gave it a nickname: the Year of Intelligence. The country turned and looked squarely at the machinery it had built, and then mostly stopped watching. The most famous of these efforts was a Senate committee led by a senator named Frank Church, which set about examining the hidden activities of the intelligence agencies across the previous decades. It was a genuinely extraordinary moment. Elected officials, in public session, questioning the most secret institutions in the country about what they had actually been doing in the shadows. Some of what emerged concerned Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Much of it ranged wider, into operations around the world. Together, it painted a picture of a secret government that had, at times, operated with remarkably little oversight. The Senate committee was not working alone. A parallel investigation ran in the House, and a presidential commission examined some of the same ground, so that for a stretch, the secret institutions found themselves answering pointed questions from several directions at once. Not all of these efforts ended in agreement, and some generated nearly as much friction as light. But together they marked a real shift. The principle was simple. Even the most secret work must answer, eventually, to someone. And it was being asserted out loud, by people with the standing to make it stick. Feeding this reckoning was an internal document that had already begun to surface. An in-house catalog the agency itself had compiled of its own potentially questionable activities. It had a wonderfully understated nickname. People called it the Family Jewels. It was, in essence, a list the institution had made of the things it least wanted known, and its gradual exposure to daylight was exactly as uncomfortable as that description suggests. An organization built on keeping secrets had written its most sensitive ones down in one place, and then, inevitably, that place did not stay sealed. What came out of all this was real, and it mattered. Programs were confirmed that had only been rumored. Oversight was strengthened. New rules and new committees were created to watch the watchers, on the reasonable theory that a democracy should have some idea of what is being done in its name. For a moment, the machinery of secrecy was forced to explain itself, and it did not always enjoy the experience. There is something almost gentle about that image, if you let it settle. The most powerful hidden institutions in the country, sitting in a bright room, being asked plain questions by ordinary elected officials, and having to answer. Out of that season came lasting machinery of a different kind. Permanent committees were established in both chambers to keep watch over the intelligence agencies. In the years that followed, new laws set limits on what could be done in secret, and required at least a measure of oversight for what was. None of it was perfect, and the arguments about exactly where those lines should sit continue to this day. But the drawers, once opened, could not be fully shut again. Even that internal catalog of secrets was eventually released in full, decades later. The in-house histories of the very operations we have followed tonight were declassified later still. They arrived in the daylight long after most of the men who lived them had grown old or passed on. But here is the quieter truth about reckonings, and it is worth carrying into sleep. They are never complete. A great deal came out in those years, but a great deal did not. Some files stayed classified. Some stories waited another 20 years, or 30, for a later round of declassification to bring them into view. That is precisely how the internal histories of the operations we walked through tonight eventually reached daylight, long after the men in them were old or gone. Secrecy does not surrender all at once. It gives ground slowly, a folder at a time, usually only once the people it might have embarrassed are safely beyond embarrassment. That delay is not really an accident. It is closer to a feature. By the time a secret is finally safe to tell, it has usually lost most of its power to change anything, which is a large part of what makes it safe to tell. The men who fell into the dark were long gone before their program's failure was admitted on paper. The commandos were old before their own country conceded they had ever existed. The pattern holds across nearly every story we have visited tonight. The truth arrives, eventually, but it arrives late, and it arrives tired, and it arrives to a room that has mostly moved on. And so, the covert war ended much the way it had been fought, in pieces, out of sight, on a schedule set by other people. The parachutists dropped into the dark. The commandos declared dead while they still breathed. The cable sent on a quiet Saturday. The war denied while it was fought. The analyst who was right too early. The program named for a bird. All of it slid, over decades, from the locked drawer to the open shelf. What had once been the most guarded knowledge in the country became something you could read on an ordinary evening, drifting towards sleep as you are now. That is where we will leave it, not with a verdict, because the honest ones are still being argued, but with the simple fact of the thing brought into the light. The drawers are open now. The dark has given up most of what it was keeping. And the rest, whatever remains behind the last few classifications, is patient. It has waited this long. It can wait a little longer, and so can you. Somewhere in a warehouse tonight, a handful of folders remain sealed. They can keep their secrets a little longer. You have earned your rest, and the history, at long last, has told nearly all of it. The parachutes came down decades ago, into clearings that were waiting for them. The captured radios have finally gone quiet. A cable sent on one slow Saturday still waits in an archive, filed beside the memos that warned against it. The airline that never sold a ticket has been parked for good. What was buried has, for the most part, been lifted back into the daylight and read aloud, in a voice about as tired as your own. Nothing here needs guarding anymore. So ease the drawer shut, close your eyes, and let the dark take over from here. Sleep tight,